viewers. It's James Kalm, guy on the bike, your half-assed reporter, and we're going to do what we do here. We're running into the Martos Gallery, 41 Elizabeth Street. And we're going to take a stroll through. And this is going to be a personal indulgence for me. And take a look at Dan Asher, an anthropologist on Mars. Well, I say this is going to be an indulgence for me because, well, I guess like a lot of people, I knew Dan, and I watched his development and progress from the early 80s through until the time that he passed away. It says here in the press release that was 2010, so it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. We'll stop and take some more extended viewings of some of these pieces. This is untitled, circa 1980s, 59 by 56 inches. Well, I first bumped into Dan while I was working at a place called Utrecht, which doesn't really exist anymore. They've been bought up by the Dick Blick Company. And at that point, Utrecht was an art store, 111 4th Avenue in the East Village. And I started working there, I guess, about 1980, 81, right as the East Village scene was starting to take off. And, well, I used to bump into Dan. He would come in and shop occasionally, and I always would run around on my lunch hours and visit various galleries and sort of see people floating around the neighborhood. And Dan was one of the personalities that kind of was attracted to the East Village, and I believe he actually lived on East 10th Street, at least for a while. This is titled, Untitled 1985, oil on canvas 78 by 74. This is actually an unusual piece because a lot of Dan's work was done on found objects, found pieces of paper, cardboard, and so he didn't really make, I guess, like studio-style paintings. A lot of it was very salvaged or scrapped together materials. Well, I was always, in certain ways I was intrigued, but I was also kind of fatutzt. When I bumped into Dan, he was just beginning to think about going into the world of painting. Up to that point, I think his major practice had been photography, and I think one of the things that he was known for was a couple of rolls of film that he was able to get pictures of Bob Marley. And I remember talking with him about people wanting to buy the film, buy the rights, and people that were using these images without giving him a percentage. And that was one of the main things that he concentrated on at the time that I first bumped into him. Looking back on this work from 30 years ago, and having seen some of this firsthand and not taking it that seriously, I have to say that maybe death has the final glaze, the final patina on there that changes the reading. But as I said, he was part of the East Village scene, and so he was constantly running around and bumping into people like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring and Kenny Scharf and some of the other people who would become the stars of the East Village. Mark Kastabi. This is titled Untitled, from the 1980s. The thing that amazed me is that Dan would be, I guess, what would classically be called a Luftmensch, an air person. I could never figure out how he made a living, how he supported himself, how he could afford an apartment. I guess there were stretches of times where he was actually homeless, and he commented to me a couple of times about how bad it was to stay in some of the homeless shelters. One of the reasons that I was always kind of, maybe I was jealous, as I said, vertutzt, is that Dan was a very impetuous kind of character, and I always thought that if you're going to be an artist, you had to go to school, you had to study, you had to learn how to draw, you had to learn color theory, you had to learn about materials, the archival quality of various things, and you had to have a basic grasp of art history. And, Dan kind of blew all that away and just decided, who needs that? I'm just going to be a painter. And so the people that he kind of modeled his career on, or his approach, were Jean-Michel and maybe some of the other, I guess what you would call the more expressionistic than Neo-Expressionists that were popping up in the East Village at that time. This is Untitled, 1980s, painting on canvas. And this actually looks like this might be maybe even tempera or some kind of water-based paint, maybe thinned down acrylic. Well, because Dan didn't have a job or a family, he had plenty of time to go out and kind of roam the streets of the East Village at a very important and kind of open time. So he was able to situate himself into a lot of positions that really gave him access to a whole developing art scene. Okay, we're not going to look at all of these pieces, but this is kind of what his archetypical image would be, the kind of the expressionistic face. There was a very kind of strange competitive spirit with a lot of the artists in the East Village. And one of the funny things was everybody was kind of competing to be the most non-competitive, the most outsider, the most truly primordial expressionists. And Dan and Jean-Michel Basquiat kind of pushed deep into that territory. Some other people, I can't even remember their names, were also pushing there. And I was looking at some of these and thinking, at the time, we just look at Dan's work and go, well, it's kind of grungy and pathetic. And now looking at it nearly 10 years after he's passed away, you realize that maybe it's just the patina of age that there are a lot of young artists, very well-known artists, that are biting on his kind of the grubby authenticity of the work. I was thinking, especially with some of the canvases that have got the footprints and the hand marks on them, I was thinking of Joe Bradley has kind of figured out how to produce that kind of rugged, sad, scrappy authenticity somehow. Well, as I said, I was a friend with Dan, and I kind of tried to support Dan. I'm not going to get into the details, but I'll just say that because I worked at Utrecht, I was able to provide him with certain discounts on some of the materials. And, well, in one case, I made him a deal. I said, Dan, I'll give you a bunch of stretched canvases if you do me a painting. And he said, sure. So I went and got a bunch of canvas at the store, stretched it all up nicely, primed it. I guess I gave him about 10 canvases, all nice size, so say 3 by 4 feet or around there. And I gave him the canvases. And then about 2 months later, he came and says, okay, look, I'm going to give you the painting that I promised. And I said, oh, great. And he gave me a painting that was painted on a blind, a roll-up blind. And it was just kind of splashed in there. Not that much different. I still have it in my own studio. Not that much different than these pieces. But I felt like Dan had kind of stiffed me. I'm thinking, geez, Dan, I gave you the stretched canvases. You won't even give me a painting on the stretched canvas? And then I realized that what had happened is that, well, like I said, Dan was living such a hand-to-mouth existence that I think what he did was he took the stretched canvases that I'd given him and sold them, probably just so he could get enough money for food and rent, and then went back to his old practice of painting on whatever kind of scraps he could find. And then I think maybe sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, Dan had started to get a little reputation, but somebody had introduced him to people in Germany, and he went and lived in Germany for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I don't think he ever learned to speak German. But that's when I first saw his work with this sculpture. And I've got a little catalog at home of a bunch of pieces that he did that was all in dental wax. Okay, so this says Dan Asher, 1994. I'm actually surprised that this much of his sculpture has survived. Yeah, this looks like it's pretty fragile, and it would take a lot of time and effort just to keep this stuff from disintegrating into powder. Now, if you wanted to scan some of the deep files of the James Kalm report, I'm sure that there are glimpses of Dan. I would, just to tease him, I would come up and ask him to respond to certain shows, and, well, he never disappointed. He was well, first of all, he was very funny, but he was also very, very perceptive in his own particular way, and a real personality. I loved him. And I think it was at a Damien Hirst exhibition up at Gagosian on Madison Avenue that I walked in and saw Dan, and Dan had his head shaved, and I kind of jokingly said something to him about, gee, Dan, I like your new haircut. And he said, well, it's not on purpose. And at that point, I realized that Dan was probably sick.
Are you both with me?
Haircut looks good, man.
It's not on purpose. There's a reason behind it.
How's the show? Just like that?
Yeah. More or less.
This is untitled, 1983 oil stick on paper, 30 by 22. Actually, I was kind of amazed at this piece. This is actually a nice piece of, I don't know, that's Arches, BFK. So it's rare that Dan would be working on something this nice, but still, you know, it's got his marks, his surface, the grunginess. Well, then as I started to ask around, Dan kind of dropped out of the scene, and then I think he had a show of work that was organized by some young friends at Michel Algus, maybe in 2008, 2009, and at that point he was in the hospital and had been on pretty heavy chemotherapy for a while. And, well, his young friends were still hopeful, but he didn't make it, and passed away about 8 years ago. I'd always wondered what would happen to the estate. I didn't know whether there would be enough survivable work that he would be able to pass on some kind of a heritage. And like I said, he never really had a solid a place to live, a place to store the work, a studio to work in, all that stuff. A lot of this was done very close to the cuff. And, well, it's interesting to see that the Martos gallery has been able to somehow get this all together and maintain the work. I think I spoke to the proprietor a couple of years ago and said I have a nice piece that's on a window shade. He said, "Oh, bring it in and we'll give you an estimate." I think I'm going to hold on to it. Yeah, Dan was one of these crazy guys. He'd drive you crazy, and you'd be so totally annoyed with him, and then you would see him and talk to him, and you would just he would melt. Anyway, Dan, glad to see your show. You can all comment, make your suggestions, critiques, reviews, talking points. But as always, we have to say thanks, Dan, and thank you, Kate. Thank you. Thank you.